Thank you. And thanks for the invitation to come along and talk about some of the things we've been doing in Hull as part of a bigger project led by Dundee on trying to understand something about the effects of tidal turbines on the 3D flow structure and then through into how that interacts with the seafloor and the seabed. So today I'm just showing a small summary of some of the work that we've been doing and concentrating on the work we've been leading down at Hull in the experiments and running our total environment simulator system to look at these kind of impacts of tidal turbines on the seafloor. So I'm preaching to the converted here in terms of the importance of this research, trying to understand those interactions, trying to understand the impact of these sorts of devices on the natural habitat and seafloor dynamics. And what we've been trying to do is advance our capability in terms of physical modelling of these systems so that when we come to the numerical modelling, some of which just presented before, absolutely fantastic. I hate following numerical modelers who show fantastic videos of things. But to try to help parameterize some of those sorts of models when you put in some of this more detailed flow dynamics obtained from the physical modelling. So we've conducted a whole suite of experiments as part of this research and then trying to link that through to the numerical modelling as part of the broader partnership. So today what I'm going to do, as I said, is concentrate on some of the experiments we're doing. I'll give you a flavour of some of the things we've been looking at and basically concentrate on just showing the difference between a couple of things in the suite of experiments we've done. First and foremost, the distance essentially from the bed that the tidal turbine is positioned at. This is our experimental setup. So this is the total environment simulator we have down at Hull. It's a large basin, 16 meters wide, 60 meters long, 6 meters wide, and within it we've put a subset channel into the center of the domain. We can do all sorts of things in here in terms of making it rain, making waves, making flows, etc., sediment transport and recirculate, a whole host of things. We also have a whole range of capability in terms of measuring flow dynamics and measuring sediment transport that we've been utilising in this suite of experiments. So the main setup we had was the flume, the channel down through the middle, 1.5 or thereabouts meters wide. We had a flow positioned coming out of our inlet domain, concentrated down this channel, down to the outlet, and then pumped underneath the system, recirculating both sediment and water. Positioned to the laterally, we have a submersible PIV, so particle image velocimetry system, that allows us to quantify holistic flow fields of the turbulent flow field. The rotor was positioned in the middle in here, and we did a range of experiments both with a plain bed, with just a roughened bed with a sand-coated bed, and then a range of experiments where we put in a subset box, if you like, filled with sediment, mobile sediment, and then we did full suite runs where the entire sediment, the entire bed surface was covered with mobile sediments as well. So we slowly built up the complexity of the experiments we were conducting. Those of you not aware of how PIV works, you essentially have a laser positioned downstream. It's a planar laser, shoots right up the middle of the channel in this diagram here, though you can move it on the traverse up and down through the domain. And then we have two stereoscopic cameras looking in to give you the 3D maps of flow across a section that's imaged in the middle. And of course we concentrated in and around the turbine rotor. Just to give you a quick overview of some of these, so the roughened bed surface, just placing varnish on the floor and then roughening the bed by sticking sand to that essentially, just standard sorts of methods in these sorts of modelling techniques. And then the mobile bed inserts where we put mobile bed actually within the domain. You can maybe just see on the projector here the edges of that domain in there. And then the picture here is essentially that laser light sheet shooting down the middle. This is the submersible camera system looking in through the sidewall of the flume, this clear perspex sidewall in the flume, so that we can image the middle of the flow domain and quantify the flow and turbulence within and around the rotor. This gives you a video of just a really slowed down video of the sorts of quantification we're doing. Apologies for the codec on this didn't work so well, so the quality is not quite as good as it can be. But it gives you the overall idea. This is the turbine swinging round, obviously, and these are the particles that within the flow, neutrally buoyant particles carried by the flow, that we use with a sequence of images to essentially quantify the flow structure and the turbulence within the domain. The setups, for those who are interested, it's a 1,000 millijoule laser, pulse laser, 2 cameras at 4 megapixels each, and they essentially imaged an area within the domain of around 30 centimetres by 40 centimetres in terms of the actual measured area in the middle. Everything was on a 3D traverse, all linked together, so that we could move the laser and the light sheet and the cameras all together within that domain, so that when we calibrated, we were able to run that across the whole volumes of the flume. We took a time series of that flow domain, as you saw in the video, double framed at around 50 hertz for those who are interested, and essentially used those 2D vector maps to produce 3D maps of the flow field. And what we essentially did is then did that over a series of panels. So this is where the rotor is. So we did this over a series of panels that we stitched together by moving the PIV camera and laser domain up and down. And we also did some lateral things as well that I won't talk about today. But then that essentially gave us this much bigger domain where we were quantifying the properties of the flow field in the wake of the rotor. And the thing I'll talk about today is essentially moving the rotor from one position in the vertical. So this is an XY view you're looking at of the maps. This is the vertical, this is the downstream, and these are the rotor locations where we just varied that position in the vertical. We did a series of plane channel runs, as you'd expect, to provide a baseline or benchmark data set. So we can look at the velocity profile here, vertical axis just height, and then flow speed along the bottom here as you look. And you can look at the kind of standard sorts of velocity profiles that you'd expect within the middle of a flume flow domain. We then put in, we've done a whole host of different experiments, different rotors, different tip speed ratios, all sorts of kind of a matrix of experiments that crossed over. But we based it on a 3-bladed horizontal axis. The diameter of the scaled version that we had fabricated was around 20 centimetres. And as I said, the tip speed ratio that we went with in the experiments I'm showing here is about 5.5, and the overall blockage to the flow, the aerial blockage to the flow is around 3%. These are results that we get, the sorts of results that we've been able to get. The top panel, these are contour maps of velocity in meters per second. The top panel is 300 millimeters above the bed in terms of the rotor. So there's the rotor. This blacked area is where we couldn't obtain data because of laser light reflection and poor seeding. This kind of gives you the overall picture of the wake in the lee side of the rotor. As we move closer to the bed, and the main thing I want you to take away from this talk today is just the changes in terms of the wake structure in the downstream portions of the fluid flow behind these rotor systems, and how that interacts with the seafloor. And what's really interesting here is two main things. One is the symmetry of the wake downstream when it's higher within the flow, and then the asymmetric patterning of the wake as it's interacting at the same time with the seafloor. And also how quickly, in terms of the narrowing of that wake downstream in the two different cases. Higher in the flow, that narrowing happens much more quickly, so that the diameter of the wake is reducing more quickly downstream. Of course, we're able to then look at velocity deficits from the pane bled run, to look at how far downstream these sorts of effects are mitigated or carried, just to give you an idea of the sorts of impacts that those sorts of turbine devices have at different elevations, and actually quantify something that we can non-parameterize and begin to play with in terms of looking for patterns within positions and tip speed ratios, etc., etc. We also looked at velocity in terms of its vertical orientation, and again you can see variations in the magnitude of the vertical velocity in and around these turbines at different heights. I'll just point out down here, much higher the contour here, much higher downwelling and upwelling as a result of the turbine being lower down, and then also the patterns of that sort of downstream patterning of the vertical velocity, which is obviously important for momentum transfer to the bed, very different in the two different cases. So very different patterning as a result of just placing the turbine at slightly different positions above the seafloor. We're also able, with the system, to look at turbulent kinetic energy, and again, some really interesting patterns come out in terms of the turbulence that's produced in the wake zone, how the turbulence produced both from the tips, if you like, of the rotor as it's spinning around, coalesce downstream, a few diameters downstream, around 3 diameters downstream. You get that coalescence of those two wakes from both tips. On the diameter of the rotor, but in the case where it's closer to the bed, you get a very different pattern of the downstream turbulence as well. So some really interesting things that we've been able to pull out of some of this data in terms of the turbulence patterns in the base of the flow. We can look at how that's propagated downstream from our baseline, looking at the percentage change here of turbulent kinetic energy as a result of those different patterns as we move downstream in the two different cases. And then the final thing I just want to talk to you about and just show you and showcase, I'm happy to talk to people over lunch about it. What we've also been doing is looking at the effect that this turbulent structure that I've talked about here in detail and the changes in that vertical momentum exchange with the bed, how that propagates into seafloor scour, which is ultimately what we're going after. So some of the results that we've been getting in terms of how we generate scour with different positions of the rotor above the seafloor, and when it's higher within the flow, as you'd expect, you get less seabed interaction and as a result less scour. But we're trying to constrain that and non-dimensionalize that for future investigations. And then finally, we've been able to put with our colleagues at the National Oceanographic Centre in Liverpool, they came across with some really cool acoustic kit, like an acoustic curtain that gives you measurements of sediment transport dynamics and the flow at the same time. So they've been developing that over a number of years, Pete Thorne and the group down there in Liverpool, and we've been able to run a suite of experiments that build on what we've done with the plain bed runs and our small sandbox experiments looking at scour, to look at the full flow field in a much more complicated domain of a completely mobile bed under a range again of conditions of heights, different rotors, different tip speed ratios, etc., etc. So I think we're beginning to build a pattern up here in terms of understanding that how the flow and the scours interact over a range of different conditions, and we can look at how, with maps of the seafloor, after different lengths of time, what the impact of those flow structures actually are on the seafloor. So, to summarise, some key findings just to take away from the brief talk today. Thinking about lowering the rotor to the bed, how it impacts on the asymmetry of the wake, what that lowering does and the asymmetry does in terms of turbulence kinetic energy, the patterns of turbulence in the lee side of these rotors, and ultimately what they do in terms of sediment transport and scour in the lee side of these sorts of features. And as I said, it's part of a much bigger grouping who are then using this key data that we've been able to get from our physical experiments to put them into numerical models, which obviously allow us to scale and generalize much more capably than we can within a suite of experiments in Flume. So with that, thanks ever so much for listening, and I'll happily take questions and talk to people over lunch.
This production is brought to you by the University of Edinburgh.